Guilty conscience. Okay. The registers are what?
I said,
You
took your jacket off. And he said, well, now she's complaining that it's too hot.
I'm not complaining. I was cold when I came in.
And I said, well, when you're standing up there between those registers and it's running, it gets hot.
And you get to talking in front of all you guys and yeah. Okay, so I looked up the word conscience, and the meaning of it is an inner feeling or voice viewed as acting as a guide to righteousness or wrongness of one's behavior. And what is your name? Lorena? It's going to be a long night. Lorena immediately said, guilty conscience. Guilty conscience, right? So as we think of that, we don't think of a good conscience. We always think of a guilty conscience because we did something wrong.
So what is a good conscience?
I'm going to tell you about it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay, so, and it's really interesting because when you get to reading the Bible, there's a lot of verses in there about a good conscience. Okay? There was a mother that was helping her son with his spelling assignment, and they came to the words conscious and conscious and conscience. It's hard to say this too. Conscious. Oh dear Lord, help the girl. Came to the two words conscious and conscience. Okay, conscious and conscience. And when she asked him if he knew the difference between the two, he replied, "Sure, Mom. Conscious is when you are aware of something. Conscience is when you wish you weren't."
Oh, I like that.
Okay, so that kind of tells you a little bit about it right there. Let's turn to Hebrews chapter 9. Chapter 9, verses 13 and 14. This is talking about the blood of Christ, okay? In verse 13, it's talking about the old way, the sacrificing of animals. But verse 13 says, "The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean." In other words, it didn't do anything for them inwardly, did it? They were just outwardly clean. But verse 14 is really where I thought it was really good. "How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death so that we may serve the living God." Isn't that good? When you think about it, because you always, Christ died for me and saved me from my sins. But think about your conscience. You know, he cleansed our conscience. Okay, from acts that lead to death. Him making that sacrifice, he was spotless, wasn't he? He was sinless, without blemish. He was the Lamb of God whose moral perfection qualified him to take our sins once and for all. So he was morally without blemish. Isn't that amazing? He had no sin, but he's also morally without blemish. His blood cleanses the conscience from acts that lead to death, bad conscience. His blood provided us with a moral renewal that purifies the conscience. Isn't that good? Can you imagine running around all the time with a bad conscience? Some people do. But this blood allowed us to be cleansed from the dead works that unbelievers produce in trying to earn their own cleansing. A lot of people try to do lots of things to make their conscience feel clear. But the only thing that will do it is the blood of Christ. And it frees us from these works that lead to death to serve the living God. And let's flip over to Hebrews chapter 10. 21 and 22. Ooh, I need to be taller. Verse 21, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. So the heart sprinkled was figuratively speaking. Remember when the Israelites sprinkled blood over the doorpost of the Passover lamb? Okay, that's figuratively speaking there. This blood delivers us from a evil or from a guilty conscience. Okay? So, but what is the Bible meaning of conscience? Well, Byer's definition says that the soul, as distinguishing between what is morally good or bad. That's basically it, isn't it? It's either good or it's bad. Prompting to do the former, which is the good, and shun the latter, which is the bad. We're supposed to do the good and shun away from the bad. So commending good, condemning the bad, okay? So what made me feel compelled to talk about this? I've been thinking about this word conscious for quite a while.
Did you watch Pinocchio?
Pardon me,
That's where it
Pinocchio?
came from.
No, I don't-
Jiminy Cricket said it. Let your conscience be your guide.
I don't believe that. No, actually, 2-3 weeks ago, I don't know, in the Thursday Bible study, we've been studying Paul in Acts, okay? His journey and his dealings with things. Let's turn to Acts 23:1. And Carol said something, and I'll tell you what she said a little bit later, so she can just sit there and go, what'd I say, what'd I say, what'd I do? It's all good. Oh, yes, pass the offerings.
Put the debit card in there.
Acts 23:1. Now this, Paul is standing before the Sanhedrin. And it says, Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and he said, my brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. Here he is, he's standing before the Sanhedrins and he said, what are you doing to me? I've done nothing wrong. I have a good conscience. But in verse 2, Ananias, the high priest, he didn't like that. He ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Can you imagine? Here he is talking and they come up and slap him in the mouth. How would you feel?
That.
You've seen that?
Yeah, the Oscars.
He did not let his conscience be his guide there, or he did. I don't know.
Okay, back to normality. They were not the high priest. Okay. But Paul was a servant of God. He was being falsely accused. He was standing before the Sanhedrin, and the high priest ordered him to be slapped in the mouth because he says, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. Why would you be slapped in the mouth for saying something like that? But then Paul reacted and said, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, blank, 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 blank. No, he didn't. He didn't be blank, blank. He called them a whitewashed wall, which is basically, you hypocrites. You look good on the outside, but on the inside you're not doing so well. Well, then Carol, our studies then took us over to chapter 24, verse 16. And now Paul is standing before King Agrippa and Felix, the governor. Excuse me, Festus. Porcius Festus. I love that name. Porcius Festus. So verses 24-16.
Just a small one.
Here's what he says. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. And then he proceeds to defend himself. But can you imagine standing before a judge and saying, I don't know what I'm doing here, I have a clear conscience. You know, though, I didn't do anything wrong, what's with you? I have a clear conscience. How many, you usually don't say that. Isn't that interesting? I have a clear conscience as standing here before you. Well then, this statement of a clear conscience was given, that Carol gave, and it just like, you know, when some things are said, it just kind of lights, ooh, that's so good. So I had to even have her say it over again, so I could write it all down. But here's what she said. A clear conscience causes, okay, an inner freedom of spirit that God is not offended by our words and actions. Isn't that good? Carol, am I going too fast, Michelle?
Yeah. It reminds me of another teaching that you did. I'm not sure how long ago, but you called it R&R.
Oh, yeah.
And it reminds me of that because you can't have that rest if you don't have a clear conscience before God. There's no peace in you to be able to rest.
Yeah, but when I taught that, and when you heard me, did you think of clear conscience? Conscience didn't even come to my mind. Didn't even come to my mind. But when we were studying this with Carol in Acts, here he is standing before all these people with a clear conscience. What a thing to say. What a thing to say to these people. And I want to read it again. A clear conscience causes this inner freedom of your spirit that God is not offended by our words and actions. We can speak, we can act with a clear conscience because we're pleasing the Lord in our words and our actions. Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's not new science or anything, but when you think about it, that is really, really good. There is no pillow so soft as a clear conscience. That's right? If you have a clear conscience, you sleep like a baby. But in 2 Corinthians, let's turn to 2 Corinthians 1:2. Paul was being slandered. So even though we go through tough times and the people are making fun of us and picking on us and this, that, and the other, look what Paul does. In 2 Corinthians 1:12, he says, now this is our boast. Our conscience testifies that we have conducted ourselves in the world, and especially in our relations with you, in the holiness and sincerity that are from God. He's saying, even though you're talking bad about me, even though you're saying things that aren't true, my conscience is clear. I haven't done anything wrong. I haven't done anything wrong. And I think just reading through this whole thing of Paul, through all these, this is the letter to the Corinthians that he wrote, his conscience was clear. And look, it says, I conducted ourselves, he's talking about him and his helpers, we have conducted ourselves in the world. Not just in the sanctuary, but out in the world. He's conducting himself, and he has a clear conscience. And 2 Timothy 1:3. This he's writing to Timothy, and the reason I'm reading a lot of these scriptures is to just show you that's what he has. He talked about it all the time. He says, I thank God whom I serve as my forefathers did, with a clear conscience. As night and day, I constantly remember you in my prayers. He has a clear conscience remembering them in their prayer. He isn't there going, oh man, I shouldn't have said such and such to that guy. No, he had a clear conscience. He could pray for them. Whatever your name is back there in the back row. Michelle.
Do you think maybe because prior to his Damascus Road experience, do you think maybe before then he didn't have a clear conscience?
I don't think so. Yeah, you're right. He did not have a
And
clear
so like that's
conscience.
like a vast I know I think about like prior to salvation, man, this about me, or I was this way, and then now I like notice or make sure, like, this is, God has changed this in my life.
But yeah, and for those of you that don't know, Paul used to kill Christians and was doing it for the glory of the Lord, he thought. And he was changed. Yes? Do you have a headache?
No, I raised my hand, I'll let you talk.
Oh, so anyway, so he became a Christian, became a changed man, and yeah, he probably had a bad conscience, but that conscience was cleansed by the blood of the Lamb. He believed in the resurrection of Christ. And that was what was getting him in trouble in Acts. Yes.
I was thinking the very same thing. Sometimes, as teachers or as preachers, a lot of times we teach or preach on the things that we struggle with the most that we're learning to go through. When you look at Paul's actions prior to his conversion, you mentioned it, he murdered. And that's not an easy thing for an individual to actually go through life. And even if you are saved, even if there's no offense with God, sometimes we've offended ourselves so much. And this is where PTSD happens within the military, is when an individual shoots another individual and it's not a good thing, it's not justifiable, or they feel guilty about it. Your conscience is a very fragile thing when you have to live day in and day out, night after night, with the thoughts of something where you have unjustifiably taken the lives of individuals. God can forgive you and help you deal with your conscience, but murder is a very difficult thing. And I often think that that's what his thorn in his flesh was, is that even though I know God has forgiven me, I have a hard time even fathoming the fact that I'm even here.
Yes, and you know good and well Satan.
Right.
That's what
Very
you
much.
used to do. Yeah. And maybe that's why he tells us all the time, have a clear conscience. Don't let it get the best of you. Have
Right.
a clear conscience. Have a clear conscience. In Hebrews 13:17, he says, obey your leaders and submit to their authority. They keep watch over you as men who must give an account. Obey them so that their work will be a joy, not a burden, for that would be of no advantage to you. Okay, and then in 13:18, pray for us. We are sure that we have a clear conscience and desire to live honorably in every way. I particularly urge you to pray so that I may be restored to you soon. Now, I read verse 17 because he's giving instructions. One of the ways to have a clear conscience is to pray for your leaders. Obey those who have authority over you. Don't sit and complain about them, Margaret. Don't, pray for them. Obey them so that their work will be joy. And I think this is also speaking about our spiritual leaders too here. Our spiritual leaders, we need to submit to their authority, not to be in bondage, but take what they're teaching us. Take what they're teaching us. And because the person that's teaching, they have to give an account to God, don't they? They have to give an account to God. And if we submit to them and make it easier for the leaders, their work becomes easier. It isn't such a burden. It's more of a joy. Okay, right, Gary? Right on. Okay, you can right on. You don't know? Oh. Okay. So let's serve ice cream and we will leave and go home. 1 Timothy 1:5. I was teasing, there's no ice cream, so don't get excited. Calm down. You've had 3 of those things and your sugar level is...
Yeah, I got to go work it off.
Oh, gotta walk to bed, right?
Oh, yeah.
1 Timothy 1:5. This section is Paul is warning Timothy, hey, beware of false teachers. Okay, there's false teachers out there. Did you know that love, look at this in verse 5, the goal of this command is love. Did you know that love comes from a clear conscience? What a concept. It says it right there. The goal of this command is love, which comes from a pure heart and a good conscience, and a sincere faith. We usually sometimes talk just about the pure heart. You gotta have a pure heart and have faith, but look, good conscience. Love comes from a good conscience. If I have a good conscience, I'm not gonna say anything bad about you, right? If I have a good conscience, I'm gonna try to let what you say about me go, "Foop," probably not, but "Foop."
Yeah.
No, but you know what I'm saying? It's important to have a good conscience. Love comes from a pure heart, good conscience, and sincere faith. And then jump down to verse 19. It says, holding on to faith and a good conscience. Now, what he's telling Timothy to do is not listen to these false teachers. Hold on to faith. Isn't that enough? We're our faith. We have faith in the Lord. Faith, but look what he added. And a good conscience. Isn't that interesting that he added that too? He added faith and a good conscience. Why? Because those that rejected, some that have rejected these and so have shipwrecked their faith, they forgot about the true teaching. They forgot about the good conscience. If you don't have a good conscience, your faith is going to be shipwrecked, isn't it? They were destroyed. They rejected it, and their faith, their whole experience was shipwrecked. Deserted island, I don't know, but shipwreck doesn't sound too pleasant, does it? Being shipwrecked. Let's turn to 1 Timothy 4, just go over a couple chapters. And we all are probably familiar with this verse, 4, 1 and 2. The Spirit clearly says that in later times, some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. Such teachings come through hypocritical liars, whose conscience has, that's a hard word to say, have been seared as with a hot iron. Ouch. Seared as with a hot iron. That's pretty serious, isn't it? If something's seared, it's pretty well fused together, melted, hard as stone, right? And then turn over one book to Titus, chapter 1. I know we're doing a lot of verses, but that's why we have the Bible, right? Because it gives us lots of things to read. Titus 1:15. To the pure, all things are pure. But to those who are corrupted and do not believe, nothing is pure. And look what he says. In fact, matter of fact, listen to this, he says, both their minds and their consciences are, sorry guys, do you know what I'm trying to say? Consciences are, will somebody say that word for me? Consciences. Am I saying it right? Consciences, it sounds like an Okie slur or something. Both their minds and consciences are corrupted. Why? Look at verse 16. I'm in Titus 1:15, 16. 16 says, they claim to know God, but by their actions, oh, did you hear that? By their actions, they deny him. I like what he says. He says three things about him. They are detestable, disobedient, and unfit for doing anything good.
Abominable.
Verse 16.
Oh,
Abominable.
Abominable. Disobedient.
man.
Yeah, well, mine, yeah, is that what yours says? Mine says detestable. Who else has a different version?
Oh.
I think detestable is pretty bad. Disobedient,
Oh,
unfit.
Worthless.
Worthless.
And
What's
worthless
that?
And worthless for any good deed.
Did you say worthless?
Yeah, it's next.
Unfit for doing anything good. So if your conscience is seared, what did I say about a clear conscience causes that inner freedom, remember? That inner freedom of spirit, that God's not offended by any of our actions or words. We have freedom to talk. We have freedom to go about our life because we have a clear conscience. Do you have a question?
Yeah, sometimes, like Pastor Steve was saying,
He's not speaking to my.
No, but he made a comment.
Okay.
Anyway, it's soldiers that are doing something that they really don't want to do under orders, but they have to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Or whether they can challenge. Sometimes that doesn't work very good, but yeah.
For who? The one giving orders or the one receiving?
They're the ones receiving it,
Uh-huh.
to do something. And when they go to trial, they say, I was under orders to do that.
Oh, something bad.
Yeah.
Steve said that.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, reason I even brought this up is what's happening in Ukraine, where are these Russians doing what under orders, or are they actually doing it because they
With a
want to?
seared conscience? I can't answer that. Only God can. But
Yeah.
it's not good.
You know, I was thinking, they read back there in that searing it with a whole iron, it uses the word branding of iron.
Ouch. Yeah.
And, you know, when you think about the fact that your conscience, if it's been seared by something that's left its mark, and that mark is like that seal of authority in your life. So if you allow something in your life that affects your conscience, and then if you continue to do that, it will ultimately sear your sensitivity to the error. And then what happens is the enemy seals it with that branding iron. And, you know, so
It's a
many
scary
Christians,
place
I
to be.
think, live these lives where their conscience has been dumbed down and the evidence is outward. You can see it. They're not living. You said love.
Uh-huh.
Love comes from a clear eye. They don't have any love in their life. They don't have peace in their life. They're supposed to be Christians. Well, a lot of times there's evidence, some kind of searing or branding that goes on from the enemy, I think.
Yes, I have an example here. I thought was really good. It isn't dealing with the piercing iron, but it's showing how slowly you get numb. Okay? The conscience is like a sharp, square peg in our hearts. Okay? If we are confronted by a questionable situation, that square begins to turn. And its corners, as it turns, cuts into our hearts. Doesn't feel very good. It's cutting, okay? It's warning us with an inward sensation against doing whatever confronts us. But if the conscience is ignored time after time, and this wheel keeps cutting and cutting and cutting, you know what happens to the square? Soon it becomes a circle, right? All the edges are worn off. It becomes a circle. And don't feel a thing, right? When that circle turns within our hearts, there is no inner sensation of a warning. Okay? And we are left without a conscience, like you were talking, just like searing it. Yes?
So another way that relates, there was a verse or two that talks about the corruption of the conscience, right? How you end up corrupting it.
Uh-huh.
So let's say your metaphor there of following, just continuing to sin, searing that conscience. Once you've done that, you've corrupted your conscience, and it's just that much easier to now make excuses for another sin,
Yeah.
right? And to continue to get into something else, continue to do another sin
Yeah.
over and over, and you just gradually corrupt your conscience more and more, basically, where you don't feel anything about
Yeah, and that's
all
what I
of
was
that
saying.
bad stuff you're
You're-
involved with. So
How did it word it? It said that there is no inner sensation of warning. You know, when you've done something wrong, you know, maybe it does. All the alarms go off inside. How'd they catch me? You know, there's an alarm going off in your body telling you that's wrong. You shouldn't do it. Well, I'm going to do it anyway. No. Yes.
I like this verse in Romans chapter 1. It says, Furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind to
Yes.
do what ought not to be done. They've been filled with every kind of wickedness. And it goes on to list all of these things. And they practice them, and they don't think anything of it because their minds have been corrupted. And God gave them over.
Their warning bell is
That's what
broken.
happens when that
Yeah.
peg has turned enough. God gives them over to a depraved mind, and then I don't know how you come back from that. When God gives you over, how do you?
Isn't
come
it
back?
exciting though that what we read, that God's blood covers, not just, it covers our conscience. I just thought that was so good that, yes, Steve?
Sorry, statement. I started thinking about your analogy and the way that you just asked the question, how do we get back, to where that is a square hole and not a round hole? Well, that's why you come to church, because that's where a lot of conviction happens, because what do they teach in church? The truth. So it puts those corners back in there and says, hey, these things, even though you say that it's okay here, and I've been putting this whole round thing through this square thing back at the church, it's still got square edges. And so we come back, and that's why many Christians that don't want to live uncompromised lives, and they want that compromise, and then they have a hard time staying in church because that's where those corners are.
Because if you don't hear it, the warning
Right.
bell doesn't go off, right?
Yes.
I was talking to someone here a while back about actions they were taking in their life that they didn't feel was wrong, and so I was talking to him about it, and finally he said, I honestly do not want to hear you say another word about this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Conviction. I hope your warning bell doesn't get worn out. You're under conviction. You're under conviction, So let's go back and look at Paul real quick in Acts 23. I want to point out something, and Carol pointed this out, that he had the clear conscience. We read in verse 1 in 23 that he said that I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. But then, let's read 2 through 5. At this, the high priest Ananias, we already said this, ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Did I say that wrong?
It just sounds right.
Oh, okay. You whitewashed wall, okay. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. Those who were standing near Paul said, you dare to insult God's high priest? But look what Paul said. Look what Paul said. Oh, brothers, I didn't realize that he was the high priest. For it is written, do not speak evil about the rulers of your people. Oops, he had to apologize because he had a clear conscience. He didn't want to mess up his clear conscience. Excuse me, I'm being slapped in the face. I can say whatever I want to. Right? That's what the human nature wants to do. What a testimony. No, he's saying, no. You've been slapped in the face, take it. Don't go that low to start acting like them, basically. Okay, I thought that was really good. Romans 13, I'll just read it, verse 5, is talking about being in submission to the authorities. Did you know we had to be in submission to the authorities?
No.
I know it. It's verse 5 says, it is necessary to submit to the authorities. I like this, not only because of possible punishment, if you get caught, you might have possible punishment, but I like what he said, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. Oh, but nobody saw me speeding. But nobody, conscience, right? So Paul was really wronged, and he had a right to give them a piece of his mind in the physical. But he's saying, don't have a good conscience. Stand before men so that they can't say anything about you. Even when you're being slandered, they're still going to say good things about you. There was a verse about that, and I didn't write it down. Are you guys familiar with it? That even when you're slandered, they can't say anything bad about you because you've acted accordingly. So when we are wrong, can we say that we stand with a clear conscience confronting our accuser? Can we say that? Sometimes it's hard, isn't it? I love this example in the Old Testament of David. Go back to 1 Samuel, my favorite part, what I've been talking about on Sundays, but we're up ahead of our story. This is David. The background, most of you probably know that he was appointed king of Israel, but he wasn't in the role of king yet. King Saul was still the king. But King Saul hated David. David had to run for his life, literally hide, and constantly be on the run. Him and his bad boys go all over the country, and King Saul was always in pursuit of him. Isn't that something? We won't get there. But anyway, 1 Samuel 24, that's what's going on in chapter 24, verses 1 through 13, and most of you are probably familiar with this, but when David was told, look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are looting the threshing floors, he inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? The Lord answered him, and go attack the Philistines and save, whatever it is, Keilah. But David's men said to him, here in Judah we are afraid. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the Philistine forces? But once again, David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered him, go. Isn't this interesting that he's asking the Lord, what do I do?
Yeah.
He isn't going, okay, get your guns, we're going out and shoot them. No, he's asking of the Lord, okay? So David and his men, so now let's start in verse 7, okay? Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah, and he said, God has handed him over to me. For David has imprisoned himself by entering a town within gates and bars. Is this where I want to be?
Says 24.
You said 24, 1 through 13,
Yeah,
but
I'm
that's not
sorry,
what
the
mine
23,
looks.
I'm going, what?
It didn't
Okay, erase, 24.
I'm like, oh, wait, here.
So all that happened. Now we jump over to 24. Why did you put in those ponchos?
Really?
After Saul returned, now we're on 24:1. Everybody with me? I'm with me now too. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way, and there was a cave there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. Isn't this interesting? They're way back in this cave hiding, and here comes King Saul in to relieve himself, okay? The men said, whoa, this is it. This is the day that the Lord has made. No, they didn't say that. This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed. Can you imagine? You've got to see the intensity of this. Quiet. He goes up and he cuts off a corner of Saul's robe.
Right.
Should probably cut the whole thing off. But afterward, verse 5, afterward, David was conscience stricken.
He felt bad.
Is that what that means? He was conscience stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. And he said to his men, oh, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. And with these words, David rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. This didn't happen when Saul left the cave. This happened when Saul was still in the cave.
Right.
That peg hurting his heart there a little bit and going, oh, who am I? I'm not supposed to touch God's anointed. That's not me to take care of. That's for God to take care of. Did he have every right to do this? Yes. You know what I mean? In the natural, in the Hollywood movie film, he had every right to take his dagger, whatever he had, do whatever you do. But he didn't, because he was conscience stricken. I thought that was so good. Verse 8, then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, my lord the king. When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He's even showing respect to him. He's bowing down before him. He's after his life. I would be afraid, off goes your head. He was probably a distance away, I don't know. He said to Saul, why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lift my hand against my master because he is the Lord's anointed. But he had proof. He said, see, my father, look at this piece of your robe. Dangle it. See, this is yours. It's in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but I didn't kill you. Now understand and recognize that I am not guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. He was exhausted. He was exhausted from running. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. But my hand will not touch you. May the Lord avenge you of your wrongs, not me. It's not me, okay? As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. Isn't that amazing? That's a story that we may have heard since we were little kids. I don't know, and you kind of get numb to it, but when you think about it, when you think of the reality of it, that there he is right there, I can get him, I can go home and sleep at night, I don't have to run, I can have a warm bed, I can have a warm shower, I can eat warm food, I don't have to run. No, it wasn't for him. It wasn't for him to take that into his own hands. He, was to have a clear conscience. Okay, anybody have anything to add to this? Yes.
That was a test of David, of his faith and his faithfulness to God. That's why God could say he's a man after my own heart.
And remember, son,
When he knew God's heart was not for him to do this wickedness, because it was wicked. Don't touch the Lord's anointed. It was a test, and he passed very, very well.
but sometimes we want to help God out, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes we want to help God out and go, get rid of this guy. Let me do it. I do it better. After all, I'm supposed to be the king. Let me be the king. Samuel said I was going to be the next king. But no, it's all in God's timing, isn't it? And you said that David was a man after his own heart, and remember, that's what Samuel told him last Sunday in the lesson, that you blew it, Saul. I'm going to get a man that is after my own heart. He has a conscience. David has a conscience. Saul didn't have one. I think his conscience was seared. The peg was so round, it was just spinning inside of him. Okay, guys, we're a little bit early. Anybody want to say anything? Michelle?
So this is a note that I saved that Pastor Gary sent to me. One of the many times that I want to run my mouth back at somebody. You know what I mean? Like,
Pastor Gary.
I'm just being honest. He sent me a text message through a situation because I want to.
I'm glad you did that.
Deal with somebody out of the flesh, in the flesh.
Right.
And, but it's out of Isaiah 54, and it's verse 17 in the Amplified Classic. But no weapon that is formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue that shall arise against you in judgment you shall show to be in the wrong. This peace, righteousness, security, triumph over opposition is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, those in whom the ideal servant of the Lord is reproduced, and this is the righteousness or the vindication which they obtain from me. This is that which I impart to them as their justification, says the Lord. In other words, shut up, Michelle, let me deal with it. That's You know what I mean? Like, because it just reminds me of when I go and ask a kid why are they doing something, and their answer is, well, he was doing it first. You know what I mean? I mean, that's exactly, well, that doesn't make it right. You know, and so oftentimes I want to deal with something out of the flesh, and
Because
no,
sometimes the
can't.
flesh thinks it can fix it quicker, but we always get deeper,
But it's,
deeper,
but it's
deeper.
more, I feel like it's more wrong because I am supposed to be a representation of Jesus.
Mhm.
The person that we're dealing with is of the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're representing where they're from, and if I be reacting out of the flesh, then I am not showing any glory to God.
Well, and that's a hard test because,
Which I have
you're, pardon?
at times. I said, which I have failed at times.
Well, I think we all have.
Yeah.
I know I have. Because you're dealing with the world. It's just like today. I just thought of this. It was sunny today. I was sitting in the backyard. Rod said I could sit in the sun for 15 minutes. But it was so nice out there. And so I was sitting there, and I had some worship music on coming out from the door. And it was just, And then the old man behind me.
Wonder what he's gonna do, cut down one of my flowers?
And immediately I thought, where is that coming from? Because he's known for doing a lot of things in my yard. But I'm thinking, where did that come from? Talk about a conscience. I'm speaking on conscience tonight. I'm being tempted already to throw rocks over the fence. But do you see what I mean? We have to be an example to everybody. No matter what they do to you. Steve?
I was just thinking about how you mentioned Saul and what his conscience must have been like during that time. And I think you can kind of take and go back to Romans when you read about how God, because they didn't honor God and glorify God, they turned them over to a reprobate mind. And you go back to chapter 18 of 1 Samuel and you see where Saul begins to be jealous of David.
Oh yeah.
And,
that's what's
and at some point, in verse 10, it says, it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house after David. And at some point, he throws a spear at David, and you think, well, that's like you said, a conscious being seared, that they could have taken those thoughts captive.
Mm-hmm.
And they could have, like you did, said, wait a minute, why am I thinking like this? Why am I being jealous? But when we give in to those things and we make that jealousy really a part of us and we feed on it, that's where that branding iron of jealousy, man, it sears in there. And at that point, you've been given, God says, fine, if that's what you want, I give you over to it.
Yeah. I'm trying. I've been trying. But you're not yielding to me.
Right.
Yeah, you're not yielding to me. Okay, I have one more thing. It's almost, isn't this tax season, considered tax season, April 15th?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a word of wisdom for you guys, okay?
I gotta write some checks too.
You gotta write some checks. Okay. The IRS received the following letter from a conscience-stricken taxpayer. Imagine that. A taxpayer that had a conscience. And the letter said, "Dear sir, my conscience bothered me. Here is $170 which I owe in back taxes. P.S. At the bottom, it read P.S. It said, if my conscience still bothers me, I'll send in the rest." Do it right. Not may the force be with you, may the conscience be with you, right?
Word.
You can go.
Oh, is that it?
Dismissed. Everybody in the hall.